Hi, my name is Claire. I'm the course leader for A-Level Law. I'd like to introduce the course to you today. Now, just like all A-Levels, A-Level Law has 3 papers, and in the time available to me today I can't possibly introduce all, so I've chosen one of them to talk to you about this morning, and that's criminal law. So we have paper 1, criminal law, paper 2, tort, paper 3, contract. Each one of these is examined at the end of 2 years through a 2-hour exam. So today, as I say, criminal law. So I've chosen a small aspect of criminal law, factual causation. Now there's a few abbreviations that I need to explain to you. When we're discussing causation in fact, teachers usually illustrate it through use of a chain. So as you can see on the screen here, we have a chain. And each one of the links in that chain represents an event in the case, so something that's happened in that case. And the chain of causation always begins with the defendant. And you'll notice that we abbreviate in law defendant to D. It's one of the words that we use all the time and one of the words that you will use in an exam. So it's absolutely acceptable for you to refer to D. So D is at the beginning of the chain, and at the end of the chain we have the victim. V. Every single one of these links in the chain is an event that takes place in the case. The test that we use to assess whether the chain of causation has been broken is something called the but-for test. Now let me explain. These aren't 2 words that in 2020 you tend to see aside each other. So for instance, today happens to be a particularly miserable day outside. If I explained my lateness to the principal, let's say I'd been late this morning, by saying, but for the bad weather and the heavy traffic on the M62, I wouldn't have been late. That's a little bit clunky, that's a little bit old-fashioned phrasing. So what I might say is if it wasn't for the heavy traffic and the bad weather on the M62, I wouldn't have been late. But it's exactly the same thing. This is what I mean. There's our chain again. This time, instead of me being late to work, I'm a defendant, so I am D, and I have stabbed my victim. Told you it's very cheery, this, in A-Level Law. So the defendant has stabbed the victim, and as a result of that, the victim has died. Now that's a very simple case. There are no events that break that chain, so there's no bad hospital treatment, for instance. Nothing has broken that chain which links the defendant's act to the victim's death. So the test we use is the but-for test. So but for D stabbing V, V would not have died. Or to use my traffic analogy of earlier, if it hadn't been for the defendant stabbing the victim wouldn't have died. So what you see on the screen is the application of logic. There is no break in that chain of causation, so the defendant is what we know as the factual cause of the victim's death. Now, the best way of demonstrating factual causation is through cases. Across A-Level Law, we cover several hundred cases, and ideally you will have good recall of them all, ready for the exams at the end of year 2. But just right now, we're going to consider 2 cases. Now, these are actual cases, they happened. This isn't something that law teachers make up to amuse students. These are real cases. And perhaps you can see why from this case, the wording of the but-for test is perhaps a bit clunky for 2020. It originates in this case, 1910. This is the case of White, and Mr. White had had enough of his mother's company. He decided he was going to kill his mum, and he put poison in her drink. Expecting her to drink it, she took a sip of the poison and then promptly died of a heart attack, which had absolutely nothing to do with the poison. And this is how you would record your case facts in law. So a summary of what happened in the case. The defendant was charged with and convicted of the attempted murder of the victim. And here comes the but-for test for the reason why. But for, or if you prefer, if it hadn't been for. If it hadn't been for D putting poison in his mum's drink, she would still have died. Because what he didn't know and what she didn't know is that she was going to have a heart attack. So he couldn't be the factual cause of her death. The chain of events connecting the defendant's act to the victim's death was broken by the heart attack. So going back to the chain of causation, the heart attack severed the links in that chain. He couldn't be the factual cause of her death. So that's the case of White. Just one more case for you to consider. And that's the case of Paget. So fast forward 73 years, we're now 1983. And this time Mr. Paget was in a spot of bother, you might say. He got himself into a gunfight with the police, and in an effort to defend himself from the police firing at him, he grabbed the nearest human being and used her as a human shield, trying to stop the police from firing at him. The human being he grabbed just happened to be his 16-year-old pregnant girlfriend. So I'll let you make whatever judgment you want about Mr. Paget. A stray bullet, and that's all it takes, of course, just one stray bullet. The police officers couldn't stop firing in time, and one bullet hit the pregnant girlfriend, as a result of which she died. Mr. Paget is charged and found guilty of her manslaughter this time, not attempted, but actual manslaughter. So again, we need to understand the reason why, and we return to the but-for test. So but for using V, the victim, as a human shield, this time she would not have died. So going back to the chain of causation, he this time was the factual cause of her death. The chain of causation was not broken. Now that's just a tiny, tiny glimpse into the sort of thing we cover at A-level law. Just 2 cases out of several hundred. I hope it made sense. I hope you enjoyed listening to it. If you want to test the little bit of law you've heard this morning, why not have a go at the interactive quiz which is attached to this presentation. Thank you very much for listening.